Oh, I'm totally sure.
No, it's always positive.
Appreciate that. Yeah, I can write it.
We still have it.
Okay. Thanks.
I can always. There we go. Just an audience. See who's here.
We're moving towards the lit.
This new camera's so cool. Do what? I said our new this new camera is so cool. It's really nice. It's very sophisticated. Like if I had a little bit. We have like a couple smart classrooms where the camera, 3 cameras in.
Yes. That's what happened. So when I did my talk,
I got nothing for them.
Nope. It's like those like motion detecting cameras and like dust sets them off. Like, have you seen those where it's like they're just like in people's houses and they're like right, like it's like going all over the place and people are like, "Am I just my crosswalkers?" Yeah.
when you see technology now that like sends you a message anytime there's a movement outside your house,
Undergraduates
because it could be anything.
Yeah,
just like a bird, like pretty car.
I'm like, but then I just want to check.
Cool. He doesn't listen to my
When it gets started. Okay.
All
All right, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. So thank you all for being here today, for those of us who are in person, and then also for the people on Zoom. Today we have a very special guest. She's a dear friend of mine. She's also an associate professor as of July 2022. So soon today, yes, soon to be associate professor at the University of Laverne in Los Angeles, California. Her book called Brewing a Boycott was published by UNC Press a year ago, so in May in 2021. She's written op-eds for the Washington Post. One was about the Goya boycott, and another was about beer equity. She's also was a Mellon emerging faculty leader for 2020-2021, and she is here today to present some of her work from her book called Brewing a Boycott: How a Grassroots Coalition Fought Coors and Remade American Consumer Activism. Dr. Allyson Brantley.
Everybody, thank you for being here. It's really nice to be at an in-person talk. I was telling Dr. Bynum yesterday that this is only my 3rd in-person talk since my book came out a year ago. So it's just really nice to be able to like share space with people, and hello to everybody who's following along on Zoom. So I'm very excited to chat a little bit more about my book and some of the research that went into it. Before I start though, I do want to say thank you to Dr. Bynum for inviting me here and making this possible. And thank you, Rachel, for all of your help. And thanks to everybody who's here today. I'm looking forward to spending some time this afternoon discussing my book and its subject. I think one of the most significant movements and moments in UX activist history in the late 20th century, and that is the boycott of Coors beer. In particular today, as you can see from the slide, I'm actually going to focus my comments on one particular constituency within the boycott, Chicano activists, because they played such a key role in building and sustaining the boycott, but that's just sort of one tiny slice of the movement as a whole. Wait, right, we do have to push one.
Try again.
Hey, okay. So what was the boycott of Coors beer? From the late 1950s to the late 1990s and maybe into the present for some, a wide coalition of people came together to boycott or reject the Colorado-based Coors beer. Union members, Mexican Americans, Chicanos and Latinos, Black activists, LGBTQ plus activists, environmentalists, feminists, and other progressive activists came together to boycott Coors. And they did so for two key reasons. One, because they believed that the brewing company was discriminatory in its hiring practices as well as anti-union. And in particular, activists focused on discriminatory practices in hiring towards women, people of color, and queer men and women. The second reason why people boycotted Coors beer was because of the Coors family's links to far-right conservative politics, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. And so this wide array of people came together to boycott the beer for these two reasons: located in the brewery and its employment practices, and then located in the family and its politics. And so when they boycotted beer, it wasn't just that they decided to choose Miller Lite at the bar. They often slapped neon bumper stickers on their cars, either in Spanish or in English. They would wear buttons or t-shirts to advertise that they boycotted Coors and asked others to join the cause. They would engage in pickets at Coors. They would picket the Coors brewery as well as events that the company was sponsoring. They would engage in informational panels, pass out informational leaflets, and then most importantly, at least for my research, they engaged in intentional coalition building across different intersectional identities. So while the boycott began in Colorado, because that's where Coors was based, it spread across the US West, even to Flagstaff, Phoenix, and Tucson by the late 1970s, and then nationwide by the 1980s. It did fade away by the 1990s because of a number of different internal and external factors. So my book details the history of this longstanding boycott, and I really focus on the boycott at the grassroots level, thinking about how and why people got engaged, what their experiences were like, and how they built a movement that lasted for multiple decades. I argue in the book that the boycott underscores the significance and the potency of consumer activism in US culture in the late 20th century. It also highlights the persistence and vitality of multiracial and intersectional coalitions into the 1970s and 1980s, sometimes decades that are characterized more by fracture than by intentional alliances. The boycott also had unintended consequences in terms of fostering corporate social responsibility as it developed into the 1980s and 1990s. So I also argue that the boycott influences unique and unintended relationships between corporations and underserved communities, sometimes for good and sometimes for bad. But to highlight these points today, I thought I'd focus us specifically on the involvement and leadership of Mexican Americans and Chicanos in the boycott. And just a comment on terminology, during most of the boycott, activists referred to themselves as Mexican Americans or Chicanos. They were more radical. And then by the 1980s, the company often used the terminology of Hispanic. So I'll move between those three terms, but I try here and in the book to refer to the terminology that activists themselves use. So today I want to highlight three significant factors in terms of Chicano leadership and involvement in the Coors boycott. One, that through their involvement, the boycott became not only a key piece of their own activist identity, but a key piece of the Chicano movement as it spread across the West and nationally in the 1960s and 1970s. Chicano activists played crucial roles in leading and sustaining the boycott for multiple decades. Second, this boycott highlights a deepening relationship and coalition between organized labor and Chicano activists, particularly in the later decades of the 20th century. And I also argue, or I want to argue today, that the boycott highlighted the consumer power of Mexican Americans by the lack of their consumption. So by withholding their consumer dollars, the company became more aware of them as a segmented or sort of well-defined consumer bloc. And the glaring absence of their consumer dollars fueled Coors' efforts to woo Hispanic consumers through segmented marketing and neutralized ethnic traditions, which lead to like this idea of Hispanic Heritage Week and Month by the 1980s. For a second there, I was like, does everyone have the notes? Because I'm so used to asking my students that. Waiting to watch. You don't need to be taking notes. So why and how did Chicanos boycott Coors beer? Excuse me. The Chicano boycott on Coors beer began in Colorado. That's Coors' home base and where the flagship brewery in Golden, Colorado is located. This is an image of that brewery, I think, in the mid-1960s. The company had been around since 1873. It was founded by a Prussian emigre, Adolf Coors, and it began by serving a pretty hyper-local distribution market. They served beer drinkers in Denver and in the mountain areas in the late 19th century. And then in the early 20th century and through the ordeal of Prohibition, they began to expand their distribution outside of Colorado. By the 1960s, Coors distributed exclusively in 11 Western states, including Arizona. But one thing to note about Coors' production and distribution is that they never pasteurized their beer. It was always cold filtered. In fact, it was cold filtered through cotton pads that included asbestos, something we can talk about later. So in order to maintain the beer's cold temperature, it could only be distributed in a certain radius. So it never really was distributed at first outside of the West. So as the company expanded its distribution, it became less and less like a local brewery or a microbrewery and more like a factory. And as it became more like a factory, Coors emerged as one of the largest employers in Colorado and one of the best paying in Colorado. Everybody wanted a job at Coors. They had a particularly large maintenance and production facility, and you could get in on the ground floor and work your way up. Unfortunately, though, anecdotes and hard data suggested that the company and its unions hired inequitably. Local activists pointed to a couple key points in the application process that were particularly key at weeding out non-white applicants in particular. One, if you applied for a job at Coors, you would go through a 3-stage application process. The first stage was a 100-question personality test, called the runner test. It was developed by sort of scientific management folks for Coors. The second stage was a pre-employment required polygraph test. So you'd be hooked up to the lie detector machine and asked questions about your personality, your family relationships, and most problematically for activists, your sexuality and your relationships with people of the same sex or even your relationship with your wife. And so this, of course, was particularly upsetting for many applicants. If somebody was able to get past those stages, they would enter a brewery that was pretty much overwhelmingly white. People of color and women who were hired at Coors, which were not that many, would be pushed into either clerical positions for women or janitorial and low-skill, low-wage kind of construction-like jobs around the plant. It's also worth noting, and activists always noted, that the company participated in a National Association of Businessmen and Ex-Offenders pipeline. So they would bring people out of prison and into jobs in the brewery. And so it became kind of understood or assumed that if you were a person of color working at Coors, you were an ex-offender. And so it created an environment that felt quite hostile to many people of color and women as well. Women wanted to get jobs on the brewery floor, but there was no bathroom even for women. So it was a pretty exclusively male space. So for activists, they start to realize that Coors is trying to curate a very white, very male, and very heterosexual and homogenous workforce. And so activists began to see Coors not as a place of opportunity, but as a place for protest and for pressure. And some of the first activists to really push against Coors to improve its hiring, and the first activists to call for a boycott were Mexican-American and Chicano activists. In 1967, Chicano activists from Jorge Gonzalez's Crusade for Justice and the veteran civil rights organization, the American GI Forum, got their hands on Coors' hiring data for 1966 to 1967. And it was basically what they'd expected based on anecdotes. This is one of the flyers they distributed. It's kind of hard to read, but it details some of the hiring data that they found. For example, in the brewery in 1967, out of nearly 1,900 workers, 52 were Latinos or Spanish surnamed, 27 were Black, 8 were Asian American, and 3 were Native American. And so armed with this data, these groups, as well as Black civil rights activists, filed individual and civil rights suits against the company. They also threatened to boycott if the suits didn't move forward. What they wanted was better access to hiring data, as well as access to jobs. And unfortunately, Coors and their lawyers really dragged their feet. They blamed individuals themselves for their inability to get hired and didn't acknowledge any kind of systematic problem. And they refused to engage with civil rights organizations kind of on a level of negotiation. Instead, they would often bring individual leaders to the brewery to be feted and to try to deal with them on a case-by-case basis. So many activists became frustrated that these legal cases were not moving forward, and they turned their attention and their energy to a boycott. In particular, in Colorado, the American GI Forum took the lead. From 1968 onward, they intensified their boycott as a way to move beyond these civil rights cases. In particular, the GI Forum would do marches in downtown Denver to bring attention to their boycott. So that's the images here from the early 1970s. On the left, you can see someone who he's a leader in the American GI Forum. He's a veteran himself, carrying signs. And then I love the image on the right. It's the Brown Berets, which is a more militant or radical organization joining the cause. And the little girl's sign reads Chicanos boycott Coors. And the sign itself underscores the multiple messages that boycotters were engaging in. One, they're calling on fellow Chicanos to boycott Coors kind of wholesale. And 2, they're defining themselves as people who boycott Coors, saying Chicanos here in Denver boycott Coors. So increasingly, the language of the boycott is focusing on being a good Chicano or radical Chicano means rejecting Coors because of their inability to engage with the community. Increasingly, also by the early 1970s, Chicano activists and others became frustrated with the Coors family for their conservative politics. The Coors family had always been conservative and incredibly influential in the state of Colorado. And today, like the local baseball stadium is named after the Coors family. But their conservatism had become much more open by the late 1960s and early 1970s. And I'll talk about the image in a second. There's a lot going on in this spoof on the can. So Joseph Coors was a 3rd-generation brewery executive. He was the sort of a particular target of boycott activism. He ran for the University of Colorado Board of Regents in 1968, and this was the first time that someone from the family had been publicly very conservative. In his time on the Board of Regents, he made clear his conservative commitments. He opposed the Students for a Democratic Society and tried to get the faculty advisor ejected from the university and reject them tenure. He opposed the migrant education program, opposed efforts for students to have access to birth control, and then also brought Ronald Reagan to campus to speak. So he became kind of this flashpoint or lightning rod of anti-conservative anger, especially among Chicano students at the university. And so these political arguments become caught up in these arguments for increased access to jobs at the brewery. And then, so the image here, this is from a Spanish language newspaper in March of 1975, but hopefully you can see, right, there's an image of a basically stormtrooper or paratrooper on the front here. They label the Coors family as a fine racist family. So the artists and activists are identifying the family as part of the problem. And then they're making a broad claim saying the beer is brewed with the blood of Chicanos. So increasingly, the iconography and the symbolism and the narrative of the boycott for Mexican Americans is becoming militant and really linked to a particular kind of activist identity. So because of the political and economic stakes, the campaign continued into the 1970s and 1980s, and it really radicalized as it did so. The call to boycott Coors became commonplace at all kinds of Chicano actions, even if they weren't related to the boycott at all. And it was increasingly linked to an activist identity. To boycott Coors was to be a good Chicano, and by sort of contrast, to drink Coors was to be a vendetta or a sellout to the movement as a whole, basically. I don't know, I keep messing with that. think it's okay. So the iconography of the boycott materials ends up kind of incorporating a lot of Chicano iconography. So here's like the eagle from the Mexican flag. And we see the same here, blending the Coors boycott with broader images of resistance. And so many Chicanos begin to see the boycott as not just about getting a couple of jobs at Coors, but about something bigger. And I love this line from a poet and professor at University of Colorado Boulder, Lalo Delgado, saying, "It's not really lettuce and grapes, or lettuce and onions and grapes and Coors beer that Chicanos are boycotting, but the racist attitudes and the oppression of the people." Now, it's worth noting too that in this period, as the boycott radicalizes, it also expands beyond the state of Colorado. This is not simply a Colorado-based movement. Through the GI Forum and student organizations like MECHA and UMass, the Coors boycott extended through the West to New Mexico, to Arizona, and particularly to California. The GI Forum chapters in California continued to support the boycott well into the 1970s and early 1980s. And boycott committees and coalitions popped up at San Jose State, UC Riverside, UCLA, and I think there was one at University of Arizona, but I can't find sort of sources to corroborate that. But the boycott is sort of expanding, and there are all these little pockets of boycott activity spearheaded by these civil rights organizations like the GI Forum. So the Coors boycott became a key component of Chicano activism. And I really see it as underscoring the significance of boycotts within the Chicano movement, taking us beyond the narrative of the farm workers and grape boycotts. But the Chicano boycott on Coors, thank you, what happened, was also a key site of coalition building with other groups. So it wasn't simply sort of an insular Chicano-only movement. It ended up being a place of bridge building. Because of other communities' many grievances with Coors, because of their hiring or their union busting or their politics, lots of other groups got involved in the boycott. The Boston Globe, I think, said in 1981, like any group on the left could find something to gripe about when it came to Coors, and that was pretty true. But a lot of these other groups that would be griping about Coors ended up learning from the lessons of the Chicano boycott. They often incorporated Chicano leaflets into their own leaflets. They reached out to Chicano activists and vice versa. And so there was this really intentional effort to bring people together in the movement. So there's intentional efforts at building solidarity, often in unexpected places. Go back. Sorry. I have a lot of embedded ones. Click. And one more. Just stay there. Wait. Sorry. My apologies. I don't know what happened with this. So one iconic movement of this coalition building or moment of coalition building is in the early 1970s in the Bay Area. In 1973, a local union of Teamster beer drivers went on strike against Coors and called for their own boycott. And pretty soon after they began their boycott, they reached out to other activist communities in San Francisco, knowing they needed to engage in coalition building to build more momentum. They ended up actually bringing Chicano activists from Colorado out to the Bay Area to help them strategize. And pretty significantly, these Teamster beer drivers, who were seen to be kind of conservative union members, ended up aligning themselves with queer activists like Harvey Milk. So they really saw the boycott as a place of coalition building and important for that reason and not simply just because they're pushing back against Coors. So this is one of the posters they would hang up around the city. And of course, my book cover comes from that. And so there's this imagery of multiracial coalition building. Okay, now, oh my God, okay, good. Another moment of intentional coalition building came in the late 1970s. When brewery workers at the Coors Brewery went on strike. They'd been in a long-standing battle with the company over labor management rights, and everything finally came to a head in April of '77. Pretty quickly after the strike began, Chicano boycotters supported the union, and strikers went across the West to build little boycott committees in order to support their strike. So this image is actually from a rally in East Los Angeles in the summer of 1977, and the United Farm Workers helped to organize it. So you can see there's a little picket sign there that says UFW, says boycott Coors. In fact, as well, in this moment of coalition building and the longstanding strike of brewery workers, a number of Chicano brewery workers who'd gotten their jobs because of the pressure of the boycott ended up leading boycott committees and boycott organizing across the West. Two of them, named Joe Abeda and Al Gauna, were part of a roving team of boycotters, and they did a lot of work here in Arizona. They worked with LULAC, the Arizona AFL-CIO, and local student groups, and they bragged that they brought down Coors sales in the state by 18.5% by early 1978. So though this strike ended in failure, actually the union was busted in December of 1978. Boycott coalitions extended into the 1980s, especially as the Coors family's connections with Ronald Reagan became even more prominent because of Reagan's election to the presidency. In particular, in the 1980s, progressive and Latino activists in the Central American sanctuary movement opposed Coors for the family's connections to the Iran-Contra scandal. Joe Coors was influential in funneling money and arms to anti-communist paramilitary groups in Nicaragua. And so this brought a new level of coalition building to the movement. You can see here from a protest in the mid-80s, where they're saying down with Coors and the Contras. So the boycott became a long-standing site of Chicano activism and identity building, as well as a site of bridge building between different constituencies. But though it was vibrant, the boycott also faced significant challenges over the years and did fade away in the late 1980s, particularly as the company became better and better at recognizing the boycott when it happened and appealing to Latino or Hispanic consumers to get them to stop boycotting. So that'll bring me kind of to my last set of points here, which is how did Coors respond to the boycott? They don't respond well at first, but they actually learn over time, and boycotters' kind of pressure on them influences the way they shape their method of corporate social responsibility. So for most of the 1960s and 1970s, the boycott didn't really elicit much of a response from the company. One thing they would do is say, well, like, our beer tastes so good that we don't need to do anything to counter the boycott because our beer is crisp, it's fresh, it's cold, and if people just drink Coors, so this was their first attempt to fight the boycott, they'll know that they shouldn't be boycotting. So of course, this is one of the ads that they would put up. Coors spent the least amount of money in the brewing industry on advertising for most of the 1960s and 70s, and I think it shows a bit in this particular. Coors just really didn't take the boycott seriously. No matter who it came from, they really thought that the boycott would not last, so they didn't do much to counter it. They would also drag out legal cases, as I mentioned before, and try to basically siphon money away from boycotters in that regard. They also preferred to do individual outreach and wooing of boycott leaders to break apart the coalition. So the LULAC chapters of Phoenix and El Paso, for example, were invited to do a private tour of Coors in 1969 and were given a lot of free perks in the hopes that they would call off their boycotts. Additionally, after a certain amount of time, Coors executives got frustrated with the boycott and they would lash out. Bill Coors, the brother of Joe Coors, would send letters to GI Forum leaders and Chicano activists repeating racist tropes and often demeaning them for their boycott. And one letter that sticks out is from late July 1973. He says, "We won't talk to you until you call off the boycott. Quote, do that, amigo, and then we will sit down and talk." And so this is kind of their first effort to respond to the boycott is not well organized, and it actually ends up kind of backfiring on them. It seems that this fuels more boycott activity because it's not organized in terms of the way they're responding to the boycott, and because at times it seems to perpetuate the notion that the company is pretty much discriminatory and anti-labor. So as Chicanos and Latinos demonstrated their consumer power and activist clout, and the boycott didn't go away as the company predicted, Coors scrambled not only to win them back, but to win that segment of the market for good, as it became increasingly visible to them as a segment of the beer drinking market. So by the late 1970s, the company makes gradual efforts to repair relations and to market to Hispanic consumers specifically. In 1976, they make a pretty high profile hire of a former president of the National LULAC, civil rights organization. His name is Joe Benitez, and they bring him onto the public relations team and send him across the West, sometimes to debate boycotters at events on college campuses, and to say, oh, you know, to basically be physical evidence that the company was changing its ways. The company also brought on Hispanic celebrities as what they called goodwill ambassadors. So one person they hired on in 1979 was the Mexican-American golfer Lee Trevino, and he would travel throughout the Southwest and California and do golf exhibitions and talk about how great Coors was. So these were some of the things they did to increase outreach and to make it look like they were doing something to change their ways and change their hiring practices, even if they were very slow to do that in their own brewery. Additionally, the company engaged in some high-profile efforts to funnel scholarship money into underserved communities. They would often advertise this in pamphlets. So this is one local California distributor is highlighting that he'd given money to the USC Latino Business Students Association. The company's philanthropic arm also gave a lot of money to Latino, Black, queer, and women's organizations, most likely to counter boycott accusations. So a couple examples of this, including these, the company gave scholarships to Hispanic students at Northern Arizona University. They helped to build the East LA YMCA, and they helped to rebuild the Latino Five Points Community Center in Denver. And they were really publicizing this a lot. So they're hiring people, they're spending money in the community, they're really trying to improve their community relations. In the 1980s, they amplify this to a pretty shocking degree for many activists. In 1979, they declare that the 1980s will be the, quote, decade of the Hispanic. And they publicize this pretty heavily in newspapers across the country. This means that they're intending to engage in much more aggressive marketing to Hispanic consumers. And since the late 1970s, Hispanic had really been the term that was on the rise, and so they're using it pretty self-consciously here. In 1978, they brought on a new ad firm from San Antonio, Ed Yarding and Associates, and an employee named Lionel Sosa ended up sort of spearheading this decade of the Hispanic campaign, and he became a key Hispanic Republican later years. So the decade of the Hispanic campaign was launched in 1979. As part of this, the company engaged in targeted ads to Hispanic consumers. This would have been in English and in Spanish, depending on where you read it, where they're saying, "I've heard Coors side and I'm satisfied," and the man pictured is described as a Hispanic employee at Coors who has like learned about Coors and changed his ways and changed his opinion on the boycott. The company also started running Spanish language ads in a variety of newspapers. This one's from actually a LULAC convention booklet from 1980 something, right? 86 is what it says, okay. So they're running new Spanish language ads and they're really targeting this segmented market. And so this is how they're kind of acting upon this idea of the decade of the Hispanic. They and their distributors sponsored a wide array of Hispanic market-oriented events. See here, like Cinco de Mayo events, different balls, boxing events, custom car shows. They would sponsor Mexican Independence Day celebrations across the country. And they became the prominent sponsor of menudo cook-offs in the West across the 1980s. They also spearheaded a Hispanic traveling art show called Expresiones Hispanas, which is one of the first of its kind. And so the company is really touting that they're spending all this money on these cultural efforts. They're sponsoring different events. They're running ads in newspapers and therefore supporting these newspapers. They're hiring people. So why not change your mind on the boycott? Other brewers follow suit. So, I mean, obviously this is actually the same magazine that I showed before, but Coors kind of leads the way, and Anheuser-Busch and Miller start to run Spanish language ads as well. So Coors kind of identifies through the pressure of the boycott that there is a market in the Hispanic West, and they're really pushing for it in a lot of different venues. And then in 1984, they signed a very high-profile agreement with a coalition of Hispanic organizations, civil rights organizations, kind of conservative, more moderate organizations, to the tune of committing actually $350 million back to the community over 5 years. They did this by supporting scholarships like they've done before, contracting with various Hispanic-owned banks, contractors, construction companies, that kind of thing, and agreeing to hire more executives from Hispanic communities. So they're really pushing hard to act upon this idea that it's the decade of the Hispanic, and that if it's a decade of the Hispanic, it's also the decade of Hispanics drinking Coors beer. And it's really an advertising ploy for them in order to repair relationships after the boycott or during the boycott. Now, it's worth noting that not all Chicanos or Hispanics or Latinos were happy with this. Many saw it as disingenuous, as an effort to buy out their community. And so it really divided Latinos and divided all boycotters as they saw the company kind of drive wedges into the boycott coalition. So first, part of the controversy was that many Latinos in particular couldn't agree on when was the right time to end their boycott. They've been engaging in this boycott, but they've never really set an end goal. Like, is it when the company gives us $350 million, or is it when the company goes out of business? And because they hadn't agreed on that ultimate goal, there was a lot of infighting over what to do by the mid-1980s. Some did end their boycott. They looked at Coors and they said, this is an upstanding company. I think we're gonna move forward and take their money. So MAPA, for example, Mexican American Political Association, is one of the first to turn the tide. But other activists stood firm. La Unión del Barrio in San Diego brought together a bunch of different activist groups to have a summit in the late 1980s to decide what to do, and they decided to keep going, in part because they're committed to their coalitional partners, and the company hadn't recognized a union yet, so they were going to wait for that. And so protests at various events continue into the late 1980s, and in some cases into the early 1990s. And this is an event from the late 1970s, but it's a picture that I love from one of the showcases of Lee Trevino's golf clinics, where this group, every time the door opened, they would shout "bigot, bigot, bigot" into the golf clinic. They would also protest all of the menudo cook-offs. So they were always there. Pretty much any event Coors put on, the boycotters were there pushing back against Coors, even if it was one of those events that was meant to assuage boycotters' concerns. So even when the decade of the Hispanic ended, calls to boycott Coors still echoed across the country. Indeed, many Latinos didn't actually see that much come out of the so-called decade of the Hispanic. The Chicano comedy troupe Culture Clash made a joke that the decade of the Hispanic had turned out just to be a crappy weekend sponsored by Coors. They didn't have much to show for it except for maybe some boycott swag or Coors swag. So the Coors boycott was a complex movement, successful at times, divided at others, and it played out in different spaces and communities for multiple decades. Now, what are the implications of this longstanding boycott? I think that it really highlights the power of consumer activism and boycotts, especially in the Chicano movement, in terms of building alliances and radicalizing and unifying a community. It also brought attention to the consumer power of this community and other communities. By being very public in terms of longstanding boycott commitments, a company like Coors had to recognize the diversity of their consumer base. So of course, this comes with risks. There's some unintended consequences here. There's the commodification of ethnic heritage, which we see particularly during Hispanic Heritage Month, but Coors, does this still quite frequently. For example, they had a big ad campaign where they were pushing for the former Raider, Tom Flores, to be added to the NFL Hall of Fame, and they were saying they were advocating for Latinos in this way. So the company is still doing this kind of ethnic commodification or kind of neutral commitments to ethnic heritage, but nothing too radical. And so this really underscores the complex legacy of Hispanic Heritage Week, month, or decade, or whatever, because it's importantly, these moments and these efforts by companies are born of activism of Latinos and their struggle for representation, just as much as it's born of like the decisions of an ad executive or a community relations person at the company. And so the next time you see Coors, there is one thing I wanted to show you. Remember that it's more than just a cold silver can, but it contains a lot of history, a lot of strife, and a long legacy of solidarity. And so I will stop there. I'm happy to talk more about this or other coalitional partners, because it's worth noting that Coors did basically the same thing with queer consumers. I'm really pushing a lot of money into that community. They still sponsor pride parades. So they've done this with a lot of different coalitional partners in efforts to really divide that coalition. So I'm happy to talk about that or really any other questions you have. So thank you very much for bearing with me. I'm excited to talk more about this and hear your thoughts.
Do we have any questions for our?
Yeah, I have two, and you kind of started to answer one, because when you showed the image of the LULAC state convention poster and like Coors is sponsoring it, like to me that signals like we're in bed with anything at this point, because that's their bulletin that everybody attended. So that kind of struck me as odd, because it seemed like that, I think that was 86. You said 80, then you pointed out that this was kind of a confusing time. So I was just wondering, was there a double-edgedness to this? Like, we're gonna take your money and use your picture on our bulletin, but we're not totally, we're frenemies still, or what? And then my second question is completely unrelated, and that is, I'm just curious, how were Anglo-Americans responding to this attention on minority groups or queer groups?
Both really good questions, thank you. So yeah, in the 1980s, think about like LULAC was by the 1980s, it's a pretty conservative, or I don't know, conservative is not the right word, a very moderate type of civil rights organization. So because of like the connection of Joe Benitez, LULAC had often been working with Coors or kind of trusting them in some way. So it was a space where Coors could kind of try out some of these things, like the ads and that. But some of the people I interviewed did talk about like trying to do what you suggested, like taking money and then using it for other purposes. For a long time, especially in the state of Colorado, if you collected Coors cans, you could return them to the brewery and get money. And so a lot of boycotters would do that and then use their money to like make buttons and things like that. But there, as far as I know, there was no strategizing at that level of taking their money and then turning it back on them, because at times actually the company, I think on one occasion, they revoked a grant from an organization because they didn't believe the organization was doing enough to uphold like their efforts to improve the company's reputation. And then your second question?
How did white people feel about this?
Well, so most of the union members who are involved in coalition in the boycott were white, especially the brewery workers and the Teamsters. And it's important to emphasize that they're always pretty actively in coalition with these other groups. Sometimes it's this big learning experience for them, especially when they engage in coalition with queer activists. You have these organizers and union members who are like, well, I never really like organized with somebody like this. And so that's an eye-opening experience. The segmented marketing, there was some pushback in the 1980s as the industry as a whole tried to like market beer towards women, for example. I don't know if people remember Zima from like the 1990s. That was kind of marketed as like a feminine queer kind of drink. And there were like, I think more conservative pockets of consumers who didn't like that. But there was never any like counter boycott in that way against Coors for their efforts.
Thanks so much. This is really interesting and totally out of my area of research. So this is kind of just a background question. What's going on in labor law, like in period? And so like in, I think it was the 1974 ad, they called themselves an equal opportunity employer. Like, is that something that's officially recognized? And what do you have to do to kind of be approved in that way?
So the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 mandated that the company report its hiring to the federal government to align with the Civil Rights Act. That's actually how Boycotters first accessed the company's hiring data, because it had to be like sent to the federal government. The company was under fire for 10 years, basically, from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for basically violating the Civil Rights Act. And they settled out of court in the 1970s. And then they could call themselves an equal opportunity employer. So the company did improve its hiring because of this federal pressure and because of boycotting pressure. But as for organized labor in this period, organized labor was really weakening in the 1960s and 1970s. And Coors is leading the way in national efforts to weaken the right of organized labor. Colorado is like a modified right to work state. And the company used sort of outdated anti-labor laws in Colorado to eventually bust the union. What the company wants is, and what the Coors family wants, is complete control over their business. They don't want intervention from anybody, whether it's the federal government or a union. They want to be able to decide when they hire, who they hire, and whether or not they're going to deal with a union, which they never want to because the union is an outsider. So, you know, the company would always say, we're doing these things because we believe they're the right things to do. They would never acknowledge external pressure in that way. Even when it's legal pressure, they've been forced to do it. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
There's a question on
Oh, it says, how did you become interested in the problematic history of Coors?
Yeah, thank you for that. Who's the question from?
It's from Devoni Rees, right?
Oh, Debony Reyes, yeah.
Thank you, Devony. I grew up in Colorado. I was talking earlier about how I grew up in Boulder, and my dad always had Coors Light in the fridge. So it's sort of this like, it was always in my life, and Coors is everywhere in Colorado. And I was never particularly interested in the history of brewing. I was interested in the history of labor and borderlands history. And when I got to graduate school, I didn't really know what I wanted to work on for my dissertation, but in a directed reading, I read a paragraph about the Chicano boycott on Coors. And I thought, like, wow, how is it that I didn't know about this? We don't even live that far away from the Coors brewery. And so I was interested in following up on the research. Originally, I imagined that I would write like a research paper for a seminar class, basically. So I did some research in Colorado and dug in more to the Chicano boycott. And what I originally envisioned actually for the dissertation was a study of multiple different boycotts in the Chicano community. So comparing like the farm workers' great boycott to the Coors boycott to the Farrah Pants boycott, which was early 1970s El Paso. But it turned out the Coors boycott was like much bigger than we thought it was. Folks had written about it in the small pockets in which it had existed. And so I was really interested in pulling the thread and figuring out how these different groups came together and how and why the boycott lasted for such a long time. Yeah, thanks, Eric.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Brantley. I was actually going to ask about that context of the Mexican American or Chicano or broader Latino consumer boycotts, because you mentioned UFW and grapes, and then I think lettuce later, and
Yeah.
then especially in San Francisco, boycotting bourbons because they were one of the largest supply or like purchasers of these pants. So I was wondering if you found any connections between these other consumer boycotts with how the Coors boycott was organized in other like locally in urban areas.
Yeah, there were a lot of connections. For Chicano activists in Denver, there were a couple times where people said, you know, in archival documents I read, where they were like, you know, the farm workers boycott, because it predated the Coors boycott, it was a sort of rural kind of Mexican-American labor issue, but it didn't speak to their challenges in a city like Denver, which was basically segregated, incredibly unequal, they didn't have access to equal employment at a place like Coors. So their boycott, they envisioned to be more of an urban kind of counterpart to the farm workers boycott. But for pretty much any activist group that engaged in this boycott, the farm workers was their blueprint. I mean, the United Farm Workers boycott really did reintroduce consumers to the idea of a powerful labor boycott. When the brewery workers went on strike in 1977, one of their main organizers, he told me in an oral history interview, he was like, I studied the farm workers boycott like I studied the Bible. Like, he was like, it was my Bible. So he prepared even more before the strike began to send strikers to cities to build coalitions like the farm workers did. And they worked really closely with farm workers and their boycott coalitions. For a while, some boycotters for the Coors boycott would stay in the houses that the farm workers had set up in like East LA. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of strategizing. I think that one way in which the Coors boycott is unique is that the name is on the can, right? It's not, you're not asking a consumer in New York to just stop eating grapes altogether, or to only eat Union lettuce, or, you know, to have them like have to study up on what they boycott. But I think the thing that really helps boycotters in the Coors case win is that it's easy to draw a connection between a family that's conservative, that's in the news, and then Coors, which is emblazoned on the can. Which is also something I didn't talk about. The company ended up marketing new beers that didn't have Coors on the can in an attempt to get around this. So like Killian's Irish Red was one of the first ones they did. They rebranded their beer as Herman, Herman Joseph's, to be named after one of their like patriarchs, because they eventually realized like what the boycotters are doing. And so they're always trying to get around it or use it in some way for their benefit.
Online question from Devin again. Where did you find the archives of the documents, propaganda, advertisements, etc.?
Yeah, most of my archival research, because what I was really focused on in this project was uncovering grassroots activism. I was really interested in the experiences of people on the ground, how they decided to boycott, why they decided to stay in it, what was happening in meetings. So most of the archives that I worked in were archives of labor unions or activists who donated their papers. They all did a really good job of keeping letters and correspondence and advertisements from Coors. And so I was able to use a lot of their resources to get a sense of what the company was responding, how they were engaging with the company. It's worth noting that Coors archives are closed to the public. So it's a corporation that's not open, their archives are not open for research. And so what I often used a variety of ways of like through activists' perspectives, trying to understand what the company did. And then right, you have to read against the grain in like a different way than usual in that regard. The company is also a publicly traded company. So a lot of their nonprofit transactions, their tax documents, their hiring records were all public. And so I was able to get some of that, I guess, propaganda through multiple different avenues.
Someone from Monica says, thank you. Can you share a bit more about the strategies Coors used to divide the various groups of organizers and how their attempts either succeeded or were resisted?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Monica. Over time, Coors ended up hiring a basically team of community relations specialists. I think they did this in the early 1980s to help them strategize how to handle the boycott. They understood, and I've seen this in some of the like marketing packets they would send out to different distributors. They understood that the boycott had different coalitional elements. And so they'd often have like a page they would send to a distributor, like, how do you counter the gay boycott? Or how do you counter the Chicano boycott? Or what do you say to people who say we're anti-union? So they were often seeing the coalition as segmented anyway. And they would use their community relations partners to basically try to offer a lot of money to different organizations. In San Francisco, the Tavern Guild, which is sort of a coalition of gay bar owners, they ended up being offered like $400,000 to finance a health plan. And the Tavern Guild ended up turning it down. But there was a lot of significant debate over whether or not the organization should accept the money. What does it mean to accept the money? Is that what they wanted in the first place? And And so I think a lot of what the company is doing is kind of sowing doubt and understanding that they were able to divide people in that way. The other thing the company did was they deputized their employees to be reporters. Like if they saw a boycott activity, they would take a picture, they would get a leaflet, and they'd send it back into the company with a reporting form so that the company would understand like who's boycotting where, and they could use that to build connections and build distrust between different groups.
So Julian is at, she says, thank you for this great presentation on the possibilities of these coalitions and the political potential of boycotts. My question has to do with your take on the limits of this form of economic activism, though. To what extent do you think it is inherently unable to address the workers' demands because it was already framed within capitalist terms, which scholars of racial capitalism argue inherently reinforces racial inequity?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thanks, Julian.
Yeah.
The boycott is, I think, a good tool when it's paired with other tools. One way I like to think about the boycott is that it's a really great platform for bringing people in at like an easy level of engagement, because a boycott really requires just you to make a commitment to yourself and to other people. A boycott is best, I think, when it's paired with a strike or other militant kind of activism, because then it's hitting a company at multiple points. But one of the things, and I'm glad you brought this up, that is a boycott really perpetuates capitalist consumerism, because it's basically saying, oh, we have consumer power, we're just going to withhold it from you until you do the thing that we want. And so there's a real limit to what a boycott can do. Even this boycott, the hardest question that people ask me, and now I'm inviting someone to ask this question, is whether or not this boycott was a success. Because I think you can measure success with a consumer boycott in a couple of different ways. One, is it instrumentally successful? Does it like put a company out of business? Does it get a union contract? And there aren't that many boycotts that are successful in that regard. The farm workers boycott is successful, but it has limits. The Coors boycott is successful for some, but there are a lot of labor union activists who see it as not a success, at least in instrumental terms, because the union was busted. The brewery has never been unionized again, at least in Colorado, and the company kept making money. So there are some serious limits to what we can envision a boycott can do. That said, I think there's also a way of assessing success in like a expressive way or solidarity building way, and the boycott does a very good job at building collective language around which to understand consumer power or activist power. And also a lot of the boycotters I interview say, like, this was really significant to me. I don't think it was a waste of time. We changed the company and this was meaningful to me. So I don't know if I'm totally getting to the question, but there are some, boycotts have limits. I think they need to be retooled over time to fit certain circumstances. A boycott like the Coors boycott might not work today, but boycotts are really resilient activist tools in the US. Like they've evaded lots of legal restrictions. They've been around since, like the Boston Tea Party, even though it wasn't called a boycott at that time. So I think that there are new ways to envision the power of a boycott, but it does work best when it's paired with other activist tools. So a standalone boycott, especially a standalone boycott with no objective endpoint, can't do that much. It's like when people put up something on Instagram and say, boycott this thing, it's not doing that much to build any kind of momentum. And so they take more work than maybe we often expect them to. I don't know if I answered Julian's question, but boycotts have limits. I still remain pretty optimistic about what a boycott can do, even within sort of the confines of a capitalist and unequal society.
I have a question on the like coalition building side. So one of the things that I really appreciate about your book is that you take a step back and you notice where the boycott, especially in the coalition building phases, faced a lot of challenges. And can you speak to some of those challenges and what kinds of hurdles that people had to overcome in order to build like a sustaining movement of this kind in this caliber?
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that when I started this project, I was like, wow, like there's these coalitions. This is exciting. And what I want to do is just talk about these coalitions, how amazing they are. And it became clear to me when working through the primary sources that there was a lot of discord and divisions and failures really in terms of coalition building. At one point I was workshopping a chapter and someone said to me, like, it sounds like actually what you're talking about at times are just loose alliances and not coalitions. And so I thought about that a lot when I was writing the final version of the book, because I think that at a lot of times groups came together in loose ways and they weren't really coalitions, but at times they were really committed to each other. And I think one of the things that they were able to do, which was really hard work, was to make mutual commitments to each other. So it wasn't just like sign on to our boycott because Coors is bad and Coors could hurt you because your XYZ identity. In the case of the Teamster boycott in the early 1970s, these Teamsters, they realized like they weren't going to get people on board with their boycott because they had a bad reputation. They were known for being conservative. So they went forward and implemented an affirmative action plan. And they really committed themselves to that. They ended up introducing union contracts that used gender neutral language. And so they really made mutual commitments to each other. That's really hard work, especially if you don't have a lot of resources, if you don't have a lot of time or people. So I think it only works sometimes. And I think coalition building, it seems to me it only really works in these sort of specific moments where there's a clear objective. And coalitions maybe aren't meant to just like last together all the time because they can be pulled apart pretty easily too.
Yeah. From Curtis, we have students interested in not only studying activist history, but who are also interested in applying in their communities what they learn in the classroom. What lessons would you say can students draw from the history and outcomes of the Coors boycott?
That's a great question. Thanks, Curtis. I think that one of the big lessons for me, so when I was writing the book and in the early dissertation phases, I was doing union organizing and community organizing. And so I thought a lot about like what lessons these resources or sources had. I think that one, I would say boycotts are good to try to implement their something that's easy to sort of build upon and add to your movement. But it's really key to have shared language and a shared objective in your movement. So with the Coors boycott case, there was a lot of shared anger, but at times they did not have a shared objective or endpoint. And that really harmed them over time. I think that it's also important to have lots of different points of entry into a movement for people. And that's not just like entry in terms of your identity and what you engage with. But one of the things I love about the Coors boycott is they're really creative in their organizing. So they had buttons, they had t-shirts, they had bumper stickers. They had these little stickers that people would attach to cases of beer, telling a consumer like, thank you for supporting fascism or bigots. And so all these like material things that you can do to sort of excite people or get them thinking in different ways is really helpful. I mean, those are sort of instrumental things. I also think it's important to not give up. For the people boycotting Coors, they spent a lot of time facing defeats. Really, for most of the period of organizing the boycott, they were facing a company that had way more money than them, way more legal power, and really was able to crush them if the company had gotten it together, they probably could have quashed the boycott much sooner. But these boycotters really stood together, they believed in their cause, they did the work to build coalition, and so persistence is really key. Just to keep yourself in the movement and to be willing to try different things. I think those are lessons that I really like to draw from this particular movement. And that even failure in a movement isn't just complete failure because you've built something along the way. It was kind of cheesy, but I think for a lot of boycotters, they see that like, even if they didn't accomplish all their goals, they did something that was really meaningful to them. And that's why it matters to them in the end.
Okay. Demi asks, have you ever thought about reaching out to the representatives of Coors to see how they would react or what their response would be?
I have actually attempted to reach out to them. I did try to access their archives because their archives are like internally operated, and I didn't really get anywhere with it. The company still, and people who work for the company have told me that there's a lot of hesitation to talk about the boycott. It was kind of this difficult period for the company. It was a moment that exemplified for company leadership the feeling that they were besieged by outsiders and people who didn't understand their operations. So I never really got a response in terms of talking with company executives. And now actually Coors is owned by Miller, which is owned by, I can't remember, InBev or Sav or something. So it's become part of this bigger conglomerate, which makes it even harder to reach people who would have been involved in this movement as it happened. But I haven't heard anything from Coors, at least in the year since my book has been out. So I mean, I hope that they've read it, right? Because it's their history too. And I think they learned some important things from the boycott. And I would argue, and activists argue, Coors became a better employer because of the boycott. They might not say that, but I think it's an important part of their history as well.
Any other questions? Okay, all right, well, thank you. So,
I will say here in Arizona, I think Coors beer is union made if it's coming from a local distributor, because Miller now produces some Coors and Miller is union, so.
Oh, in Arizona.
But if you're drinking it straight from the Coors brewery. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.